Hey guys, Arush here, and today we're talking about the four biological molecules and their respective building blocks. So we're going to talk about four biological polymers. And what I want you to know is I want you to know what they do, what their function is, and I want you to know their building blocks or their monomers. What makes each biological molecule? So before we get started, I want you guys to make a chart similar to this in your notebooks. I want you to take up a whole page, make it as big as you need to make sure you get all the material in. And what we're going to do is I'm going to tell you the biological molecule, which is a polymer. I'm going to tell you the atoms that make each molecule, the monomers that make each molecule. I'll tell you their function, and I'll give you an example. Now, you might be thinking throughout this whole presentation, what do I want you to add in your notebooks? Well, any slide that has this pencil in the upper corner, I want you to add that to your notes, okay? So let's go and get started. The first biomolecule that we're going to talk about are carbohydrates. And if we look at our food, most of our food comes from plants. If we look at potatoes and we look at rice, if we were to cut open the inside of a bean and look at the inside of one of those beans, we would see that it's white, similar to the potato and the rice. Or if we were to look at the inside of a corn, we would see that the inside is also white. So that begs the question, what is this inside of plants that we're consuming for food? And that answer is it's starch, and starch is a carbohydrate. The atoms that make up carbohydrates, they're carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And if you were to look at the word carbohydrate, you would kind of see where it gets its name from. Carbo, we have carbon and oxygen, and then hydrates, we have hydrogen. Okay? The building block for carbohydrates are saccharides or sugars. And the function of carbohydrates, they're used for super fast energy. You may hear athletes or people that are preparing for an athletic event, they're going to carb load. They're going to load up on a lot of carbohydrates. And the reason for that is they're preparing because carbohydrates gives you fast energy. Some examples of carbohydrates, well, glucose is a big one that we're going to talk about. Glucose is actually a simple sugar. So this right here, this monomer, that would actually be an example of glucose. Okay? That would be an example of glucose. It's one simple sugar, or a saccharide. Two other examples would be glycogen, which is a more complex carbohydrate. It's a polymer, and starch. And we'll get into what glycogen and starch are in just a moment. A little food for thought when we're talking about sugars and carbohydrates is anything that has the suffix "-ose. Anything that ends in "-ose, we know is going to be a sugar. So for example, if I tell you the word glucose and you've never heard that before, automatically you should know that it's a sugar because it ends in "-ose. Same thing with fructose. Fructose is a sugar because of that suffix, and the same thing for lactose. Okay? So any word that you come across that ends in "-ose, you automatically know is a sugar. Okay, so let's talk about carbohydrates a little more, specifically starch right now. So essentially what's going to happen is we're going to eat plants. We're going to eat the starch that's in the plant. And you can see here that starch is a large polymer made up of little glucose molecules, little individual saccharides, okay? And why are plants making starch? Well, starch is the plant's stored food. So the plant is making the starch for itself so it could consume later. Well, what happens is we are going to end up eating that starch. And when we eat that starch, when we eat that complex carbohydrate, our bodies, our digestive tract, is going to break them down into individual sugars. Now, after our digestive system has broken this complex carbohydrate down into simple sugars, into its monomers, okay? So now these are monosaccharides. And this right here, the starch, would be a polysaccharide. Once we break it down into monosaccharides, that sugar is going to go to our muscles. And in our muscles, it's going to get reassembled into glycogen. Okay? So you could see starch and glycogen, they're very, very similar in structure. The only difference is starch is a plant form of storing carbohydrates, and glycogen is an animal form of storing carbohydrates. Okay? And again, what's the purpose of carbohydrates? Carbohydrates provide us with fast energy. Okay? So a quick recap. Carbohydrates, they are a polymer. Their monomer are saccharides or sugars. Okay? And what's the purpose of carbohydrates? Simply fast energy. Okay? Let's talk about lipids now. So let's make this connection. Let's say I give you a few dollars. Well, if you had a few dollars, you might go spend it right away. You might go to the store and buy yourself a few snacks or spend it on some clothes. If I gave you a little bit of money, you would spend it pretty quickly. Now, if you continuously got money and you got more money and to the point where you can't even fit the money in your wallet, okay, you're getting so much money you can't even spend it, you're eventually going to have to go to the bank. And the bank is going to be your storage for money. Okay? Which way is easier to spend money? If the money's in your wallet, if this money's in your wallet, or if the money's in the bank? It's easier to spend the money if it's in your wallet. Okay? And now here's the connection. So fats are lipids. Lipids and fats are the same thing. The atoms that make them, they also have carbon, hydrogen, but very, very little oxygen, very small amounts of oxygen. So if we look at these fatty acids, we can see that all of this right here is all carbon and hydrogen, and there's only a few oxygen atoms in that whole molecule. Okay? The monomer for lipids are fatty acids. So each one of these chains, that is one fatty acid. And the function for lipids, one of the main functions for lipids is stored energy. Okay? So remember I said carbohydrates were fast energy. Carbohydrates were fast energy. Fats are stored energy. So essentially, if you're taking in so much carbohydrates, so many carbohydrates in your glycogen, okay, the glycogen in your muscle gets so filled where it can't store any more glycogen. Where's all that energy going to go? It's going to form a fat cell. Okay, it's going to be stored as fat. Some other functions that we'll talk about later on for lipids is it's a major component of the cell membrane, and it's also used for some hormones. We'll talk about hormones later on in the year. Okay, so here's some examples of lipids. We have triglycerides, we have cholesterol, and we have phospholipids. Right now for class, this is the only one we're going to focus on for this week, triglycerides. Okay. So actually, what is a triglyceride? Well, essentially, if you break that word down, triglyceride, we have tri, which means 3. And glyceride is referring to a glycerol molecule. Okay? So we have 3 fatty acids, 3 of these chains of carbon and hydrogen with very little oxygen. Okay, we have 3 of these attached to a glycerol backbone. That makes a triglyceride. Okay, and this right here is the glycerol. I don't expect you to write all these pictures down. The main thing that I'm looking for is this table with the information and maybe one picture, maybe a picture like this for a triglyceride. Okay. So a quick recap: we have lipids. They're the next biomolecule. And what are they made out of? What is the building block of lipids? It's fatty acids. Okay. What is the purpose of lipids? The main purpose, the big purpose, is stored energy, okay? Carbohydrates were fast energy. If you consume too much fast energy, too many carbohydrates, it'll get turned into stored energy. It'll turn to fat, okay? Lipids are also used for the cell membrane, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, and they're also used for some hormones. Okay, next we go to proteins. Proteins is another biomolecule. The atoms that make proteins, they're carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and sometimes some sulfur. Sometimes we get some sulfur in there. The building block or monomer of proteins are amino acids, and their function, the big function, is structure. Okay? So our hair, our skin, our nails, our organs, pretty much most things about us, they're made out of proteins. Okay? Proteins give us structure. There are some hormones that are protein-based. And another big one that we'll talk about next week are enzymes. And enzymes are very, very important to biology. And we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about enzymes. But right now I just want you to know that enzymes, they're a special type of protein. Okay? A little food for thought on enzymes is just like how sugars ended in -ose, most enzymes end in this suffix, -ase. Okay? So if I tell you the word amylase, and you know nothing about amylase, you should be able to find out or figure out that it's an enzyme because it ends in -ase. Same thing about helicase. You should be able to tell that it's an enzyme because it ends in -ase. Okay? Okay, so here are some amino acids, and essentially when these amino acids link together, they're going to form a protein. Now remember, we haven't forgot about dehydration synthesis. Every time an amino acid links together, it's going to lose a hydrogen, and then a hydrogen and oxygen, and it's going to form a water, an H2O, and then these two will be linked together. Okay? And that's all proteins link. So what will happen is eventually amino acids will form a chain, and that chain will eventually end up folding in around itself, and it'll make this funky looking structure right here that makes a protein. But right now, what do I want you to associate proteins with? Just think of it as giving us and animals our structure. So our muscle, our skin, our hair, our nails, all of those things, they're made up of proteins. Okay? So a quick recap on proteins. Proteins are a polymer, and their building block or their monomer are amino acids. What are the functions of proteins? What do proteins do for us? Well, the big one is they give us structure. Our hair, our skin, nails, organs, all of those things are made up of proteins. Another big one are enzymes. And again, we're going to talk more about enzymes next week. Okay, so just remember, just associate, enzymes are a type of protein. And also, proteins are responsible for some hormones. Okay? Let's move on to the last one. Okay, this is number 4, nucleic acids. So nucleic acids, they're made of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and now we have a new one, phosphorus. The monomer, or the building block of nucleic acids, are nucleotides, okay? And the function, the job, what nucleic acids do is they are the information to make proteins, okay? So you and I, in all life, we're all made up of proteins. Well, how does our body know how to assemble the proteins or where the proteins go? Simple answer, that information is stored in DNA, okay? That information is stored in DNA. 2 examples of nucleic acids that we're going to talk about this year is DNA and this other molecule It's very, very similar. RNA. Okay? So DNA and RNA, they're both examples of nucleic acids. Now let's take a look at the building block, the monomer of DNA and RNA. So we have one nucleotide right here. And if you look at a nucleotide, you'll see that it's made up of three other parts. Okay? We have a phosphate and we have a sugar. Now, the phosphate and the sugar, if you were to look at this strand of DNA, this portion right here, if you were to think of DNA as a twisted ladder, the sides of that ladder, this right here, that would be the phosphate and the sugar, okay? If you were to look at the base, what part of DNA is the base, this section right here, that would simply be the steps of the ladder, so these middle portions, okay? That would be the bases, okay? And I'll show you how nucleotides make DNA. So let's say this is one nucleotide, this is one monomer, and now we're going to make a polymer of DNA. What we'll see is that they just continually bond to each other. And now we formed one side of DNA. Here's the other side. Okay, so all of these nucleotides fit together and they form this double helix, this twisted ladder. Again, the sugars and the phosphates make this side portion. These bases, okay, they make the steps of the ladder. They make these middle portions, okay? So a quick recap. Nucleic acids, such as DNA and RNA, they are also a polymer. What is their monomer? It's nucleotides, okay? Now, what is the function? What is the job of nucleic acids? What do they do? They're information to make proteins, and you are made up of proteins. That's the end of this video, and I hope that was helpful, folks. See you later.